All right. Make sure it's recording. Okay. So hi, my name is Jessica Gladstone. I'm a graduate student in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland. And I'm here today with Dr. Andrew Martin, who is a professor of educational psychology in the School of Education at the University of New South Wales in Australia. Dr. Martin specializes in motivation, engagement, achievement, and quantitative methodology. So thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. The first question that I have for you is, when thinking about motivation and engagement, do you see motivation and engagement as being interchangeable terms, or that they are completely distinct constructs?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think one we're always wrestling with. Look, as a general principle, and conceptually, I do see them as distinct constructs, but with notable exceptions. I think it will depend on a few things as to how distinct they're seen and positioned in research. So, for example, depending on the study or the purpose of the study, certainly in our research program, I hasten to add, we're very sort of pragmatic in our research program. So if it's a larger project, for example, on academic and personal well-being, then motivation and engagement might be seen in the same constellation relative to other measures we might have, such as sense of purpose in life or life satisfaction. Relative to those sorts of constructs in a larger research study, motivation and engagement would be seen from the outside looking in as more in the same constellation. It'll also, but if it's a study of academic processes from an ed psych perspective, then we would be positioning them in a more distinct way. And so in that sense, they may well even be in different parts of a model that we're analysing. It'll also depend on the constructs. And so, for example, if it's a study of behavioural engagement, such as effort, time on task, attendance, then that will be quite distal from what some would see as motivation, and what many would see as motivation as an inner drive, inclination, and willingness and reason to do what you do. Engagement being more of the processes and factors following from that inner drive and inclination. And so a study of behavioural engagement would be seen as quite different from motivation, and behavioural being a little more outer, motivation being a little more inner. However, if it's a study of cognitive emotional engagement, then they're clearly more inner processes relevant to behaviour, and so they might be seen as a little more proximal and less distinct from motivation. And also depend on things like the research design. So if it's an extended longitudinal research project over school terms or school years, some might investigate motivation in one term and its association with engagement a term later. And so how do the inner drives and motives and inclinations, in one week or one term, impact outer behaviour, for example, in a subsequent week or term. In that case, again, they'd be quite distinct. But if it's an intensive, longitudinal, real-time study, then it's likely that motivation and engagement are closely and dynamically connected, and so they'll be less distinct in that sort of research design. And so I guess, although as a general principle they're distinct, the researcher will always need to be sensitive to and mindful of the context in which these two things are operationalised. And when they're clear in framing this to the reader can interpret that appropriately, and the distinctiveness or synergy of the two constructs can also be interpreted appropriately.
Great, that's a very interesting answer. And I think it will lead to great future conversations with people as well, so thank you. The next question I have is, in the study of engagement, there are many different views about how many dimensions or factors actually make up student engagement. We're interested in knowing what your current view is on how many dimensions should be included in the study of student engagement.
And indeed, as we keep researching, we will unearth different constructs and shuffle different constructs around, and so what might have been seen as motivation 5 years ago might be teased out a little more and be seen as emotional engagement now. I guess I see this answer in terms of positioning and conceptualizing engagement in terms of its higher order factors and its lower order factors. And so the higher order factors are more of the encompassing broader areas of engagement, if you like. And so, look, I'm comfortable with the tripartite demarcation of engagement that was proposed a number of years ago in terms of behavioural engagement, cognitive engagement, and emotional engagement as overarching constructs. Again, though, it'll depend on the study and its purpose as to which of those is salient. And so, if I want to look at what might be generally seen as a hard engagement outcome or factor, then I'll lean to behavioural engagement, effort, time on task, participation, attendance, and things like that. However, I guess depending on the purpose, sometimes we're interested in each higher order engagement factor, and so sometimes we actually specifically want to look at emotional engagement. But at other times, again, if it's part of a broader study like I was defining before, engagement might be emotional, behavioural and cognitive engagement might be seen more as a constellation, and in fact we might model it as one factor. And so again, it will depend on the purpose of the study and what's being investigated as to what sort of higher order factors we look at, and indeed how they're handled analytically. Now or soon, I think we're increasingly looking at other higher order engagement factors. So, for example, in the neuropsychological space, I think we're now looking at what can be reasonably considered as engagement. The biopsychological space, that's another, I believe, sort of higher order realm of engagement. And so, however, I also think there's probably just a relative handful of these higher order engagement factors. In contrast, I think there's a wide range, a number of lower order engagement constructs. And so within behavioural, I've mentioned things like attendance, time on task, effort, and there are many lower order constructs within that behavioural. Cognitive engagement, things like aspirations and other cognitive dimensions of engagement. Emotional engagement, things like enjoyment, for example, and there's a lot of other affective related emotional constructs. Neuropsych, we're now looking at, for example, neural activity in different cortical regions and sites. I think they're now, and there'll be many indicators, many lower order indicators in that neuropsych higher order factor. And in biopsych, there'll be many such factors within that: heart rate, temperature, blood pressure, and so on, and even things like, and then we enter the realm of what's bio and what's behavioural. For example, is eye gaze biopsychological or is it behavioural? And so I think we're about to also embark on new frontiers in measurement when once we enter new and cutting edge higher order engagement factors into the frame, such as neuro and bio.
Well, that's super interesting. It sounds like there are still a lot of new avenues to explore when thinking about what actually makes up student engagement. So that's really, really interesting to hear. Look forward to learning more about, the neuro components of engagement and the bio components of engagement. So my third question, and you touched on this a little bit, is what current strengths and obstacles do you see in the measurement of student engagement?
Yeah, and these strengths and obstacles are a reality of every researcher's life. Although there's a proliferation of engagement measures, and I'll get to that because I've shown my hand in terms of what I think is an obstacle. I think we're good on measurement. I think we've got a very strong, as educational psychologists, very strong tradition and an emphasis on measurement. And indeed, some of our ed psych colleagues have been pioneers in measurement, not only of engagement, but of many other constructs. And I think also as statistical software is always evolving, that also offers, that's a strength in the sense it offers new opportunities to learn new things about engagement. In saying there's a proliferation, I think actually we, even though we'll debate it and we'll have ongoing conversations about it, I think we're well intended in seeking to disentangle engagement constructs. And so I think, and there's been recent handbooks and volumes, doing just that. And I think we're good at that. I think engagement is an area of our core business. And I actually think that when you look at other fields, they aggregate and scramble engagement measures in a way that makes us deeply uncomfortable. I think we're very good at offering guidance and insight into how to disentangle and operationalize the multidimensionality of engagement. I think there are educational psychologists now who are moving into real-time engagement research, neuropsych engagement research, biopsychological engagement research, looking at engagement markers on all those fronts. We're still in the measurement phase of that. I don't know where we're so far down the track that we can engage in a lot of substantive research in those three areas of engagement, but I think we're doing good jobs of measuring and sorting out what's what. I think also in the main, I think we've conducted a collegial and constructive debate and conversation around engagement. I know we don't always agree, but relative to other fields, I don't feel this space is in any way acrimonious for ed psychs. I think we have quite constructively, lived in the same handbooks and had our chapters alongside each other in a way that I think is very well intended and progresses the field. And so I think that's actually a strength in terms of us as an ed psych community. In terms of obstacles, interestingly, all the obstacles are sort of the flip side of the strengths. And so I did note the proliferation of engagement constructs, and I think we really do try and disentangle. But I guess I won't divulge how old I am, but I've been in the area long enough to feel that generally I feel generally on top of engagement constructs, but not totally. But I got in sort of at the ground level, in the days that engagement wasn't even seen as anything. It was all about motivation in those days. I got in at I was a doctoral student, when, things like goal theory were just getting off the ground. And then that's now, for example, considered very well established. And so I do feel for students and early career researchers entering the field and hitting a veritable wall of engagement constructs that they have to wrap their head around. And so I certainly empathise there. Related to the proliferation is this classic jingle jangle obstacle. And so where we sort of, for example, identify different engagement constructs as the same construct, or treat the same engagement construct as different constructs. And that's also, that throws a lot of noise into the system as well. And so it's very important for researchers to spell out the definition of engagement in their lit review, for example, and then always give good sample items in their method section so that the reader can appropriately interpret it. But the onus is also on the reader to read these bits so that they don't get the wrong take-home message and start sort of spinning it out even further. And I think also I applaud the developments in statistical software because it enables us to learn lots of new things. But I do, when I, for example, think about end users, practitioners, early career researchers, or even people from other psych or education fields, looking at some of these very sophisticated and technical sort of measurement approaches, for example, to engagement and other ed psych constructs, we do often use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And I think we have to be mindful, certainly in these papers, ensure that there are sections of that that are sort of very plain speaking for others to digest. And the bar is always raised on what is expected of us statistically, and so we need to. And whilst I applaud statistical sophistication, I think it's also important on us to be good translational researchers, not only in the engagement space but with other constructs.
Yeah, great. Uh, it's a really great answer to that question, and I think again you've given us more and more things to think about, especially those who are interested in trying to measure and assess engagement. So the last question I have for you, as someone who's looked at a lot of cultural differences, is do you think that there are cultural differences that need to be taken into account when thinking about the generalizability of student engagement findings rather than making it a blanket that covers everyone?
And I get that. I think yes and no. And I guess I get to this and we've tried to get at this, not so much in that do we, don't we perspective, but in terms of when we do cross-cultural research, either between countries or within countries, different ethnic groups, cultural groups within countries, when it comes to measurement, particularly with motivation engagement, we've asked the question, are there differences of degree and or are there differences of kind between cultures, ethnic groups, or any groups for that matter? And so differences of degree. So in our own research into engagement, we do find differences in mean levels of various engagement factors, such as differences in mean levels between cultural groups in persistence, for example. And these might be between country differences, or they might be differences between cultural groups within countries. Then there's the question of difference of kind. So in that same research where we find differences of degree, so differences in mean levels, so one group will score higher or lower than another group on persistence, for example, although there are differences of degree in that same research, there is agreement on things like factor structure, factor loadings, interfactor correlations. And so in some of our research on motivation engagement, we do not find differences of kind. So they're seeing the same factors, the same, persistence, effort, time on task. These different cultures, these factors are present in both these cultures' academic lives. And so in terms of differences of kind, they're not seeing different engagement factors. They're not, the relationship between engagement factors are not different either. But there are differences as to how high or low they might be. And so, that's how we like to, I guess that's how we've approached the cultural issue in terms of not so much yes or no, but what's the nature of differences and disentangling differences of degree from differences of kind. So I suspect in saying that, there are some, and maybe many, pan-human engagement factors, but which may be a strength for some groups and a relative challenge for other groups. This isn't to say that the same engagement factors, there are not some factors that are unique to some cultures. I guess my point is it's to disentangle what is somewhat pan-human and what is distinct. And I think we've found an effective way of going about that is to research the extent to which there are differences of degree and or differences of kind.
Great. Well, those are all of the questions I have for you today. So I really want to thank you for joining us today. It was really, really great hearing your insight and thoughts about student engagement and all the new things that are happening. So I can't wait to see some of this more new stuff.
Terrific. Thanks very much for asking the questions.
Yes, thank you. All right, let me stop recording.